You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Okay, this is episode 26, and this is the episode based on those questions we were sent at the end of last year when we did a shout out for questions people might want to ask me. And the intention was to use this as a podcast to launch the U2 sonnets back in March, and then we were really busy and got annoyed with lots of things too, didn't we, in the poetry world? So we didn't do it, but we're going to do it now to help launch Slate Petals. And I've seen the questions, but I haven't written out long answers to them. So it is extemporaneous and it's a conversation. Clara?
Yep, okay, so let's see where this takes us. I'm going to leap straight in with a really broad question, and that is, why constraints? Yeah,
so we had this question, why constraints? And we weren't sure what that meant. Does it mean why do I write constraint-based poetry, or does it mean why would anybody do it? Both good questions. My own story is that I was a musician as a teenager. I was also really into science, particularly mathematical science. I have that in my nature, I suppose, the rules and also the melody. And those are the two things that I still think about most when I write poetry. So I played in various bands. And when my main band split up when I was in my early 20s, I decided I still wanted to carry on being creative, but I didn't necessarily want to continue relying on other people. And poetry seemed like a good direction because I could just write what I wanted and I didn't have to report back to anybody. And I found that I couldn't really do it. I started trying to write poetry and it was free verse. I think I did use rhyme and use some of the devices that you're taught at school, but it didn't particularly work for me because I didn't have the structure I had when I was writing words to music. So I had to find another structure. So I learnt about prosody, all the rules of formal poetry, in particular meter, accentual syllabic meter. And I found that gave me enough of a scaffold to work within.
Yeah, I think when you started, I think like a lot of people certainly in the UK, I don't know about other countries, our education in poetry is perhaps not the best, and you read a sonnet, but you're not taught what a sonnet is.
Yeah, it's a decent education for certain areas of poetry. We learned a lot of the main devices. We learned about metaphor and even some things that might be considered structural, like alliteration and so on. But for some reason, we weren't taught about meter, and that seems like such a shame because it's so important.
Yeah, definitely for the understanding of poetry, and I guess with you, when you started writing poetry, it was almost more like song lyrics without the music.
Yeah, exactly. So the meter provides the music. But more than that, it also forces you to say things that you wouldn't naturally say. It's a way to focus and filter your natural thought patterns, your natural speech, your natural voice. And so that interested me because I was writing these poems, just traditional sonnets, triolets, villanelles, all in quite a strict meter, a strict iambic pentameter. I've continued that. I still try to keep the meter very clean. I don't deviate too much. It's a sort of nursery rhyme-like attitude I have. Because I like simplicity, which I guess is something we'll talk about. Because people associate me with complexity, but I do have this fondness for simplicity too. So anyway, I noticed that I was having this collaboration with an alien voice, and it was brought about by the use of metrical rules. So I wondered what other rules there are. What else can I do to try to focus this voice, just this other voice? I was never too tempted by things like confessional poetry or any poetry that's just me talking in my voice, me saying what I think about things, because I hear myself in my head all day. I don't need to use that in poetry.
So do you find yourself in conversation with the voice? Do you almost collaborate and come up with new ideas together, as it were?
Yeah, it feels like collaboration. because I'm constantly trying to fight it. I'm trying to bring my own voice through in spite of the constraint, but with the goal that I don't achieve that. I'd be disappointed if I beat the alien in this collaboration. I'd be disappointed if it was me talking. So I'm fighting against the constraint, but I want the constraint to win, or not to win, but I want it to be a draw. I want it to be as much the alien winning as it is my own voice winning.
We've talked about the typical poetic constraints of meter and rhythm and rhyme. What then drew you into the other more experimental constraints, the anagrams, the palindromes, and other forms of wordplay within the poems?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily think that palindromes and anagrams are any more experimental than metrical constraints, even though everyone thinks it. They're certainly no less traditional. Palindromes and anagrams are a lot older than most of the fixed forms that are now considered these passé traditional structures. And yet somehow when I write palindromes and anagrams, people think that's an avant-garde gesture, and I'm not really sure if it is. But yeah, it's the same reason I liked collaborating with the alien voice, so I wanted to see how much further I could push that. If metrical rules were doing this for me, what would alphabetical restrictions do?
Do you ever find that it helps to focus and allow you to bring out your own natural tastes into poetry? Anyone who's familiar with your work will notice themes, for example, the planets, seasons, crows.
All the Gothic tropes.
I didn't want to say that, but yeah.
Well, part of that anyway is that I like to play with tropes. If you remember we've talked about this before, what Apollinaire said about cubism, how it was almost a necessity that they had to continue painting, that the cubists had to paint nudes and musical instruments and bowls of fruit, because if it's all about a new style, it's all about the form and the technique,
mm-hmm.
then almost the subject is irrelevant. You can just pick any subject. And so I don't worry too much about what to write about, because I'm more focused on how I'm writing about it. So that's one side of it. But obviously, yeah, I think when you decide that you're not going to go searching for a subject, the things you like and the things that fascinate you are going to slip through anyway. But there's another side to this, which is it's not so much preferences of subject, but preferences of style. You start to notice them more. So my interest in enjambment, for example, or just my general syntactic preferences, which we all have. It's one good way of identifying a writer, really. You can see how they like to structure their sentences. And I think when you're focusing on the guts of writing at the level of the letter, you certainly notice what's going on at the level of a sentence and how you're forming these sentences. And you start to notice patterns like, oh yeah, that's what I do. That's how I write, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have noticed until you have this close attention to it. But that's very interesting anyway, because you start to see that those are also constraints. They're constraints that you haven't forced upon your writing, but they're there anyway, and something at the back of the mind is forcing these constraints upon you.
Yes, so it's like your own tastes and sensibilities imprinting themselves upon the poem.
Yeah. And then it kind of goes full circle, because as soon as you notice them, you can start to apply them or not apply them depending on the poem. And then that is itself a structural device. It's another constraint. You're saying that in this poem, I'm going to use lots of enjambment. Or in another poem, no, I'm not going to use enjambment at all in this poem. And that's just as much a rule as saying this poem's going to be palindromic, or this poem's going to only use this small set of letters. And I think this gets to the crux of it, of why I really like using constraints. It's because I believe that the structure of a poem is more important than the content, or at least as important as the content. That a work of poetry can be all about what's being said, but it can just as well be about how it's being said and how it and the form that it presents. And this is where we get to like visual poetry, which you do.
Mm-hmm.
You can have visual poems that use text, but the text is completely unreadable, either because it doesn't form real words, or the words are completely obscured by paint or just by some like digital warping, which you've done. It's the same with constraints. You could say, well, the most important thing here is that I make this poem a palindrome that's an anagram of another palindrome. That's the important thing. So long as all these constraints are satisfied, it doesn't matter what the words are saying. But even on top of that, with something like that, it still has to be recognizably syntactic.
Yes, it has to make sense. There are plenty. You could write the longest palindrome in the world, but it could be nonsense and absolute torture to read.
Exactly. I mean, this is a distinction, because what does it mean by making sense? You know, it has to make sense for me in that you've got verbs and nouns and adjectives in the right place.
Mm.
So, but it doesn't have to say anything. It doesn't have to be a meaningful statement.
It just has to call back enough to the original subject that you're satisfied. Sometimes not. It has to be grammatical, I suppose. Even if within this nice grammatical sentence there's just gibberish. I'm fine with gibberish, although sometimes I'm not. And this is, I think, a really important point, that when you're working with constraints and you apply a rule, you're implying all these other small rules, and it changes from poem to poem. So there will be poems where I want to make more sense than in others. Quite often, the more strictly constrained a poem is, the less concerned I am with it making sense. Mm-hmm.
But if I'm applying just one rule, just one main rule, so for example, if I'm just writing a palindrome and I don't care about any other constraints, then I will probably try to make it as lyrical as I can. Which then again also involves using all the tools I've learned about language to make it lyrical. So there's a lot to consider when we talk about constraint, because we can't just think, well, this is a palindromic sonnet, therefore it's doing these two things. It's a palindrome, it's a sonnet. Mm-hmm. Because there's a hell of a lot else going on. And that will be different from poem to poem. So it'll be different from palindromic sonnet to palindromic sonnet. I know we're meant to be talking about Slate Petals, but if you look at Stray Arts, there are a few palindromic sonnets in that book, and they're all a different constraint, because even though that they're all palindromic sonnets, so they're all palindromes, they're all sonnets, with each one I've chosen an entirely different set of secondary constraints.
Yes.
Because, you know, the Edgar Allan Poe one, I just set out to get as many references to as many different works by Poe as possible. And so that was a fucking hard sonnet to write, because to do that with a palindrome, obviously the thing about writing palindromes is you write something in one direction and you don't really know what you're going to get in the other direction. Mm. So it's a real balancing act, trying to make sure all the references are neatly spread out throughout the sonnet. Another sonnet in there is the Frankenstein one, which is probably one of the most readable. So is the one that I feel comfortable reading aloud. With that one, I got to do that nice complementarity of subject and form by saying, well, these are all going to be short sentences because it's stitched together the way a palindrome is stitched together and the way Frankenstein's monster is stitched together. But that actually allowed me to get a bit more musicality in it. The Poe one doesn't have that so much because it's so intent on getting the references in. Which, in fact, with the Poe one, that allowed me to break some of my strictest rules about palindromes. It's the only palindromic sonnet I have, and perhaps the only palindrome I've published, that breaks two of the rules that I always have about palindromes. One, it uses an abbreviation, but that abbreviation is MS.
Yep. For
manuscript, which in the poem should be read MS. And that's obviously a reference to a Poe story, MS found in the bottle. And it also has a misspelling, which you should never do in palindromes. But I spell the word never, N-E-V-A-R, because it's raven backwards, which is, of course, not just a reference to Poe, but it's a reference to Lewis Carroll and his famous riddle, the why is a raven like a writing desk, where his answer uses the word never spelled that way. So your proclivities, which naturally come out when you're writing anyway, can then be altered and applied, meaning that the structure of every poem is different. So when people complain about sonnets, saying, well, sonnets have been done before, there's too many sonnets, well, I think every sonnet actually has its own structure, because the structure isn't just the macro structure. It's all the extra rules that go into it. It's the microstructures that make up the true form of the poem. So you have these things. You can say, in this poem, I'm going to use a lot of alliteration. In this poem, I'm not going to use any alliteration. And you can say that when you're writing free verse. You can say it when you're writing sonnets. You can say it when you're writing palindromes. You can say it when you're writing palindromic sonnets. And so these are all rules that can be applied to poetry on every level of constraint. And I think that gives each poem its own structure, not just on this level of, look at this poem, it's a palindrome. Well, yes, it is a palindrome, but it's also doing all this other stuff. So please notice that.
Each poem almost has its own fingerprint. They might look similar, but they're unique.
Yeah, and I say all this because I think structure is really important, and just as important as content. And can I talk about the Sator Square again? I always like to talk about the Sator Square.
Go on then. I think more people need to know about the Sator Square.
Well, I think if people have listened to more than one episode of this, they've probably heard it mentioned. But so it's a 2,000-year-old, probably about 2,000-year-old word square. So a word square is something that reads the same horizontally as vertically. This is a 5x5 word square, so it means that all the words have 5 letters. And it's also a palindrome. And it's in Latin. And it's, like I say, it survived for 2,000 years and is still celebrated. And its literal translation is, a farmer named Arepo works with a wheel. So if poetry is all about content and sentiment and feeling and meaning, how the hell has that survived 2,000 years? Do people love it because it says that? Of course not. They love it because of the way it's said and the structure behind what's being said. So that's why I think these things are important. And that's the answer to the question, why constraints?
Okay. I'm sure you could probably carry on talking about this for hours and hours, but we should move on. So should we go to the next question?
Mm-hmm.
So the next question, what's the most difficult constraint you've used?
So I mentioned the Poe sonnet, trying to get all those references in, and the Frankenstein sonnet was harder in some ways because I knew that it was harder because it was easier. Does that make sense? This is a funny thing. If I think about my palindromic sestina, for example, which is the poem I've spent more time on than any other, it still isn't very lyrical, despite my attempts to make it lyrical. And that's the constraint doing that, really. So in the end, that had to become, I was forced to make that like the Poe sonnet. I was forced to instead say, okay, I have to give up on making this lyrical, and instead I have to put lots of obscure references in, like to the life of Arnaud Daniel and to Dante's Purgatory, and to lust and cyclic forms and all these things. Just really, most people won't notice, but I just got obsessed with it. It's a funny thing that in some ways that is easier because you're not going to be lyrical. Mm-hmm. Being lyrical is hard in constraint. So when you have such a strict constraint, as I had with the Poe sonnet or this sestina, it's kind of liberating to say, okay, well, I don't have to worry about that. Whereas the Frankenstein sonnet, I had to make it, I say lyrical, it's more narrative, but still that's the same kind of thing. We're talking about traditional values of writing still. To try and get those across in a palindromic sonnet is hard. So in a strange way, that was more difficult. And following that train of thought, I actually think in some ways the hardest poems I've written are the ones with the fewest constraints. So just writing a good sonnet or a good villanelle. And I think there are good sonnets and good villanelles in Slate Petals that don't have any other constraints other than the form and the meter. And they're hard because I'm bared there. I can't hide behind the constraints. I've had to really think about this. I've had to really think about how to structure this poem. I've had to bring out all these other, like we're talking about the smaller restrictions, the micro constraints. I've had to bring all of those out to try and make this a good poem. And I've got to think about which ones to use and how to use them.
So it has to be more nuanced, or...
Yeah, more nuanced, but also there are just as many constraints ultimately going on as there are in the palindromic sestina. They're just of a different kind. And I didn't set out knowing what they were. I had to figure them out as I was writing it.
Okay.
So that can be difficult. But if we're talking about the true complexity of constraints, there is the palindromic sestina, obviously. There's a poem sequence from Stray Arts called Mirror Image.
Yep.
Which it's in two parts. The second part is called The Shattered Mirror, and that's 4 palindromes that are anagrams of each other. The first is a palindrome by letter, the second's a palindrome by pairs of letters, the third is a palindrome by word, and the fourth is a palindrome by pairs of words. And they're all anagrams of each other. And the first part of Mirror Image is 2 sonnets that are perfect anagrams of each other, and the first is a palindrome by letter, the second is a palindrome by word. And I was thinking after that's one of the biggest things in Stray Arts. And then once Stray Arts was published, I started to think, well, how could I top that? Going in the same direction as that, how could I top it? And that's what led to the poem pair War Ends War, which is the final poem in Slate Petals. Because I thought, well, if I've done 2 palindromes that are anagrams of each other, and one's a palindrome by letter and one's a palindrome by word, surely it'll be harder if they're both palindromes by letter. And then just to make it even more complicated, I made one a Petrarchan sonnet and the other a Shakespearean, because Petrarchan sonnets as palindromes are tough because of the limited rhyme. And then I was really surprised to find that actually that was easier to do than Mirror Image. It was easier to do 2 palindromes by letter that are anagrams of each other, 2 palindromic sonnets, than to do one where it's a palindrome by word, even though traditionally palindromes by word are easier than palindromes by letter. So I wondered why this is, and I think it must be something about the letter frequency distributions. As palindromes by word, the letter frequencies probably match normal speech a bit more.
Yes, so that they'd be skewed a bit more to things like THs being paired up and... Yeah,
because we all know H is a very well-represented letter in normal writing, but not so much in palindromes, letter unit palindromes. So then I figured out what would be tougher, and the toughest thing would be to write a palindrome by pairs sonnet, and then to anagram that as a palindrome by letter, because then you're dealing with those digraphs that you get in palindromes by pairs, and then having to use that letter frequency distribution in a palindrome by letter. So that's what I did, and that's the end of the U2 sonnets. So the U2 sonnets is the most difficult constraint, definitely, because it has the palindrome by pairs of letters sonnet, which is hard enough in itself, and then that's anagrammed to a palindrome by letter sonnet, and then there are just 5 other anagrams of that sonnet as different types of sonnet, because I was at that point, I thought, well, I've got to make the most of this. If I've done this really difficult thing, I want to make it look even more impressive by adding some more sonnets.
Okay, so here's the next question. It's a big one, and it's kind of several questions in one, so I guess you can see if you can address the points as they come, and just remind me if you want to prompt. But the question is, how do you do it? What's your process like? How does it differ between forms? And do you ever use code?
Okay, well, I'll answer the last one first, I think, 'cause that's the easiest. I don't really use code because I can't do it. I can't. So I'm embarrassed, especially as I know so many people now who can, but I've never been able to program. I just get frustrated by it.
I think people would find it weird to think that you'd get frustrated by something that requires patience and attention to detail.
You wouldn't. Yeah, programming and golf are the 2 things that make me just so angry. I've had to give them up. There are online anagram generators that I will turn to in times of need. Other than that, I just don't like to do it but I know people who do it. Doug Fink has created programs that have given him lists of words that are very usable in palindromes, and he's been very kind and sent them to me. And I don't use them, and I should, perhaps, but there are so many words. The problem with these programs is that they just give you every single word that's potentially usable. Yeah. And you can spend just as much time trawling through this list trying to find things as you would just coming up with it yourself. So in your own head, the brain is also a computer.
Yeah, I suppose it's that idea, isn't it? Just because it gives you a list of words doesn't mean they're relevant. So it can be just as hard filtering out, certainly for shorter words, I would imagine, what is and isn't useful. It's not like you're playing a game of Scrabble where it doesn't matter as long as it fits.
Yeah, exactly. Because you've got, like we were saying, because you've got all the other subsidiary rules going on. I don't want to use a word that really isn't my style just because it fits. Or a word that doesn't have the right... all these other qualities, like meter, if it's got the wrong rhythm to it, I can't use it. So it's no good that it just works.
Yeah, would it frustrate you to actually find the perfect word for the story of the poem for it to then not fit the meter and other restrictions you've implied upon yourself?
Well, it happens all the time. And music comes first, I think. Most of the time. Well, this is the thing. It's all compromise, isn't it? Whether I'm doing metered poetry or, well, I'll call free verse, but I don't mean that because it might be a palindrome, but just a non-metered palindrome. I always pay very close attention to music. That's the most important thing, apart from constraint. I really focus on music. So, but then still on occasion I will make something that I know isn't very musical if it's got that uncanniness to it, that it's just the perfect word to use semantically. Then I'll do that even at the expense of music.
I think we've had discussions about it, haven't we, when we've been editing your books?
Yeah, it's all because it's all compromise. But then all writing is anyway. Every single sentence you write, you have to choose whether you're going for music or imagery or meaning, and you just got to find the right balance for the sentence for the poem. So I'm not sure if the question is asking, because we've got this bit. What's your process like? Shall I be giving advice on how to write things? I think people like to know about palindromes, don't they?
Yeah, definitely.
So you start in the middle and work out, because that's easier. But if you're doing a metered form, so if you're doing a palindromic sonnet, you can't do that because it gets really messy. So it's better then to work from the outside in. Anagrams begin with guesswork, I would say. Don't get too technical right at the start. Instead, just look at the sentence in front of you and kind of guess what words might be there just from a glance at the letters. Mm-hmm. And then check if they are there, because that will give you more of your own control over what's being said.
And on anagrams, is there like a good length of the anagrammable letters? Because I can imagine it's like if you have too many, you've got too much freedom, and too few, you box yourself in too much.
Well, I've done a couple of really long anagrams, and they're kind of boring to do. This is ignoring the anagrams that are palindromes, because that's obviously difficult. But if it's just like a page of writing that I'm anagramming, it's so silly, really, because you can basically say what you want up until the last 150 letters. Up until then, you can just say anything. Mm. The letters are going to be there, and if they're not, you've just got to make a tiny adjustment. Just bring in one synonym. So I like the anagram lines poems, because you normally got about between 20 and 40 letters in a line, and that seems to be a good challenge, but which still gives you enough freedom to say something.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's the answer.
So, how does it differ between forms?
So how does my process differ between forms? Well, they're different forms, so they have different processes.
Yep,
But
okay.
yeah, okay, but also I can lie in bed at night in the dark writing palindromes in my head. I can't do that with anagrams. I always need to be looking at them, looking at the letters. It's quite hard to visualize, for me anyway, to visualize the letters and mix them around without having that pen and paper or the computer screen with the letters in front of me so that I can cross them out or move them around. Palindromes, for some reason, I can do all that in my head. One of my most popular palindromes is the solemn one, that I sat solemn, I saw time, opened one poem, it was in me, lost as I.
Yes.
And that was waking up in the middle of the night, about 4 o'clock in the morning. I woke up and I couldn't sleep, and sometimes when I can't sleep, I just mess around with palindromes in my head. And I wrote that one lying in bed in the dark while you were sleeping beside me. And I didn't have a pen and paper by my side of the bed, so I just grabbed my phone and typed it into Twitter and tweeted it. And it ended up getting hundreds of likes, and that was a nice thing to wake up to.
Yeah, and I think in the past, haven't you even told me that you've sometimes dreamt palindromes, either fully or partially formed?
The only one that's fully formed was a palindrome by word, which again, yeah, I just tweeted after it happened. It's interesting, but this is a sign of obsession, isn't it? But I like to think it's a sign of caring. It's a sign of being dedicated to something so much that it's just going to spill over into your dreams.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. You spend your whole waking day thinking about it, and then when you're asleep, your unconscious mind is processing it all.
It's better than dreaming about being out in public and people are getting too close to you and they haven't got masks on. You have to run away and hide.
Stop referencing my dreams. Okay, next one.
Yep, let's get on with it.
Okay, so we've covered your process. This next one then. Do you think of set forms such as the Petrarchan sonnet as closely related to the more Oulipian forms you practice, or do these forms of constraint strike you as fundamentally different?
Okay, yeah. Well, the first thing to say here is I don't really think of what I do as Oulipian in any way because I don't use Oulipian techniques. I'm a formalist. I use traditional forms, sometimes in new ways, sometimes in traditional ways. I share a lot in common with the practices of Oulipo in that I'm interested in constraints and I'm interested in new forms of literature. I obviously love Oulipo because, even before I knew about Oulipo, I was really into Calvino.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I did discover Oulipo, I was really into Perec, and I nearly learnt French just so I could read everything he did in original, but I was too hopeless to learn French. But I see a lot of people who say they do Oulipian works are really going into the Oulipo and finding out their techniques and using their techniques. So I think there's a distinction there because I don't do that. Everything I write is either a form or constraint that well predates Oulipo or it's my own invention. So yeah, so I don't think of what I do as Oulipian, but I understand the comparison and it's a flattering comparison because I love Oulipo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the question, I know who sent this question. I remember this question coming through, so I know who wrote it, and I know that they're really into the Petrarchan form. Well, I said at the start of this that I got into constraint as a result of formal poetry and what it could do in terms of focusing and altering my own voice. So on that basis, definitely I see things like the Petrarchan sonnet as a constraint. It's the neatness and the structural coherence. It's we're talking metrical constraints and constraints of rhyme, so the syllabic constraints essentially, or sonic constraints, instead of alphabetical constraints. But I mean, that's like saying that there's a difference between the letter-based constraint and the word-based constraint.
Mm-hmm.
That it's to me, it's all constraint. To me, it does the same thing. It does this thing where it's just distorting my voice to a pleasing extent.
The auto-tune of poetry.
If you like. We should give some love to the Petrarchan form, because the reason that English poetry focuses on the Shakespearean or English sonnet is because English doesn't have many rhymes compared with other languages. So obviously the Petrarchan form is Italian in origin, and there are lots of rhymes in Italian. We don't have so many in English. So that's why the Shakespearean sonnet was invented. And then you have the Spenserium, which is kind of to make the Shakespearean not quite so free. And a lot of people fear the Petrarchan sonnet because it's hard, and also because you run the risk of cliche, because there are so few rhymes that you're going to get the same words appearing again and again as end rhymes.
Mm-hmm.
But I have no problem with cliche. I think it's fun, and I think cliche is a constraint, and I think rhyme cliche is a constraint, and it's all about how you use them. So I think there should be more Petrarchan sonnets in English.
Okay.
I'd like to see that.
So you think people are just fearful of using it because they're worried about coming across as cliche, whereas it should actually embrace that aspect of the language?
Well, people are afraid of being called cliched. It's a big insult in the art world, isn't it? You don't want someone to say, "Oh, this has all been done before." It feels like a great personal attack, which I think is silly because it's how you use it.
Mm.
It's like tropes, in plot tropes or character tropes. The best art still uses them. It's just how they use them.
Yes. Would you say there's something sort of, it doesn't take away from the originality, but there's something comforting in the familiar? That there's a reason cliches become cliches. There's a reason tropes become tropes.
Well, that's true, but I mean, it's more than that. It's like I was saying earlier about, the Polonaise said about Cubism. But people don't mind the fact that Picasso was painting all the traditional subjects because they were too busy looking at how he was doing it.
Yes. Okay. Then, so, next question then. What do you think of quantitative prosody?
I think this person's asking if I will use it for formal poetry,
Mm-hmm.
which I've never done.
Mm-hmm.
I do use it because I use it when I'm creating my own cadences. So if you think about the anagram lines poems, I use it a lot in those. Because I'm playing with letters, so I can see when I've got a double vowel or a double consonant. And in those poems, I make up my own cadence based on both qualitative and quantitative meter.
Okay.
So I do use it, yet I've never written a sonnet in quantitative meter.
So you sort of use it as an additional tool, but not on its own.
Yeah, it's another tool to use, isn't it? It's just a thing worth knowing because you never know when it'll come in handy and when it's going to help really make a line sing.
Mm. So you think it could help bring balance to something?
Yeah, because it's a long syllable has weight, the way that a stressed syllable has weight.
Mm-hmm. Next question then.
Yep.
So, which kind of constraints would you recommend to poets who are new to constraints, and why?
Yeah, easy ones. Start easy. And if you're interested in constraint, there are lots of simple constraints. Acrostics, tautograms are good examples.
Mm-hmm.
One really good one to start with is the lipogram, because that's almost the perfect constraint for increasing complexity. You can start with, well, if you want to go really simple, you can say, I'm going to write something and I'm not going to use the letter Z in this. It's like, that's really easy.
So a lipogram is a poem in which you omit, or a piece of writing where you omit using certain letters.
You omit using certain letters, yeah, or you stipulate that you have to use certain letters, normally called a reverse lipogram. So you can start saying this poem isn't going to use the letter, like I say, Z's probably a bit silly, but this poem is not going to use the letter S. That would be hard.
Mm.
Famously, Perec omitted the letter E, the most common letter. So that's a good example. So I think that's the best answer to that question. Lipograms. Think about all different types of lipograms. Make up your own type of lipogram. Why not?
Okay, so now a bit of a change of direction in the questioning, going to your wider practice, I suppose. What inspired you to set up a publishing press?
Well, I'd had a few leaflets published. After being nowhere in the poetry world at all. I think this is worth reiterating, even though it has been mentioned a few times on the podcast, that I didn't have any friends in the poetry world. I didn't really know, even vaguely know anyone. And I hadn't studied English at university. I hadn't studied humanities at university. I was a physicist, and I was more into music then. So I never really had any connections with poetry until I set up my Twitter account in late 2015. And until then, you were my only reader. And it was a good move, setting up the Twitter account, because I met some people. First of all, I met Pedro, and then I met Christian Book, and other people who they knew, and people like Derek Bolu and Ken Hunt as well, both of whom got in touch with me sometime in early to mid 2016, asking if they could publish some of the poems I posted on Twitter. So they did, and they said, well, we'll give you some copies, and they sent them to me, and there were these just single fold leaflets. And I didn't know that this was going on, just people making these handmade, low cost, but elegant leaflets. For some reason, I didn't know things like that didn't exist, but I kind of thought, I was surprised that people were still doing it. So it was really nice to see that these things were being made. And I was very pleased to be invited to submit things. And in about July of 2016, I wrote a poem called Wars of the Roses and Thorns, which was a palindromic rondelle, where I used an archaic letter called the thorn, which is effectively a substitute for the digraph th. And I used that in the palindrome because it gave me more options for words. And this was a fun poem to write, and I just had this idea of how the leaflet, if it was going to be a leaflet, how the leaflet should look, that it should be on a parchment style paper, and the font should be a sort of over the exaggerated medieval style font. Not so exaggerated it was unreadable, but it should have that quality, almost cartoonishly medieval script. And I just had so many ideas for how this leaflet should look. I didn't want to send it to anybody to make as a leaflet. I thought, well, I know what I want. I should make this myself. And I'm not entirely sure why I then just came up with what was at the time a fake press for it, because it was just me making a leaflet. But I thought it needs to say it's published by this press, even though I only had any intention of just making this one leaflet ever. I thought the press needs a name and it needs a logo. And that was it. And we've stayed with the same name and the same logo. So Penteract Press. Shall I describe what a Penteract is? Because people do ask about that.
I was going to say, do you want to say why you came to the idea of or why we came to the idea of Penteract?
Yeah, well, my interest in art is experimental and structural. And I thought, what better represents not experimentation as such, but going beyond. What represents going beyond and structure. And so I thought of multi-dimensional objects. So I thought about a tesseract. A tesseract is to the cube what the cube is to a square. So it's a 4-dimensional cube, just the way that a cube is a 3-dimensional square. And I thought something with tesseract would be good. And then I looked it up and I realized there were lots of companies with the word tesseract in their name. So I thought, okay, I can't use the 4-dimensional square, so I'll use the 5-dimensional one, which is called a Penteract. And there's a ready-made logo because I just used the two-dimensional representation of this 5-dimensional cube. So there we are. That's Penteract, and it does represent what we're interested in. It's beyond. It's otherworldly, but it's also rigorously structured.
And it has a nice ring to it.
And yeah, there's alliteration in the title.
So from that first leaflet, what made you then decide this was something worthwhile?
Well, we decided it together, didn't we? But I can't remember exactly how. I know it was November of that year, November 2016, we said, let's go for it. And we put out submissions calls. I don't know why we did it, because at that point we definitely weren't thinking about doing books.
No, I think we just thought that some people had gone for the leaflet and we'd met these cool people who were putting really nice stuff out there.
I think also there was perhaps some just genuine pleasure in making them. There's something very therapeutic about printing and folding and cutting leaflets.
And I know at the start, certainly from my own selfish point of view, I did some of the cover art for some of them, and it was like my own constraint, because I was in a bit of a creative funk. So seeing these submissions come in, it gave me a reason to try and create stuff.
Yeah.
And it was quite good for me for that, because I know certainly for quite a few of the first editions, it sort of stimulated my creative practice when I was in a bit of a low place and wasn't creating much output.
Yeah, it's a constraint, isn't it? And same with me with designing them. You get given a poem that you love, and you want to do it justice, and you've got to think, well, how do I go about this? I've got to get it on the page the right way. I've got to find the right paper for it.
Oh yeah, I remember that, going to all the stationery shops, and I seem to remember, like, I'd be out in a stationery shop and sending you photos. What do you think of this paper? What do you think of this paper? And just picking the right, and then pairing the right paper. pairing the right paper to the poem. It's like, well, should this be on the lilac, or should it be on the parchment, or photo paper even, for some of the really complex visual stuff we did?
Yeah, so it was a learning experience, and fun because it was a learning experience. I mean, when I look back at those the first 20 leaflets, how much we learned just doing those. I mean, for that first one, The Walls of the Roses and Thorns, I designed that in Microsoft Word. Not ideal for designing an A5 single-fold leaflet. And
it wasn't as friendly as it is now, even. For design, in terms of like layout of images and text boxes and things like that. And just with a home printer that I think we had to replace quite quickly after we started making it work for us.
Yeah. So that's what inspired us anyway, the fact that I had this poem I really liked, and I had my own vision for how it should look, and then we just got caught up in making these things. And also, you know, there's something about feeling part of something vital.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean being part of the community. I mean feeling like you're really doing something, that you're really contributing something.
And I guess I think it was nice as well, because certainly in the early days, a lot of the people we were talking to were in North America. And this was a really good way to communicate and feel part of that community, because it's not like we could go and do readings or anything like that, but it's like we were sharing our side of the world with their side of the world.
Well, definitely. And like I say about being completely outside of the poetry world towards the end of 2015, having no readers apart from you, to suddenly be in a position a year later where we're publishing people from all over the place and working with all these people and meeting these interesting people. I mean, that's a motivating factor for continuing with the press. I mean, that's why we pushed on. So we did leaflets exclusively for about a year and a half, didn't we? And then we published Seller, which was just an attempt to see if we could put a book together. And I had an idea of how I wanted that book to look. And we discovered that it sold quite well compared with leaflets, that perhaps people don't buy leaflets as much as they buy books. And the next thing was then, by the end of 2018, when we did the Concrete and Constraint anthology.
Yes.
There's a lot of work. I remember spending so long designing that book. Everything to do with it. I've since found shortcuts, but I did things the long way round on that book.
Well, yeah, because we've had no training in any of this, have we? You know, we've had to teach ourselves everything from first principles. We're not art students. We didn't study this kind of stuff at university. We've had to.
Yeah, I can make that book in a quarter of the time now. But that did really well. You know, that sold a few hundred. And after that, we decided, no, we can do this as a proper press. And I think that's because it's fun too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Apart from when it isn't. Which is, maybe we'll get onto that at some point. I can't remember what questions we got left, but there's probably something about how it isn't fun. I think another thing we have to mention is that it worked for us, and it felt like we should be doing it because there is a place for us. Which, another way of phrasing that is that there was a void there. I mean, there are lots of very, very good presses. We know most of them who are promoting this sort of poetry. I mean, we have more of a focus on Constraint, perhaps, than...
Yeah, and I think as well that it's bridging the gap as well between the visual poetry and the more formal, experimental formal poetry. Just that idea of people who are working with constraints of any kind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we've actually quite achieved the vision we had of formal, constraint-based and visual all being together, because I think there's a lot of resistance. I don't think the constraint-based poets are a problem. I think there's resistance between the formal poets and the visual poets, who are often very avant-garde in their attitudes and experimental in their attitudes, and formal poets commit the equal and opposite crime of being too traditional in their outlooks and too conservative. And I think we don't get a lot of formal poetry submissions for that reason.
Yeah, and I wonder why that is.
It's because people are stubborn. People are... Obviously, lots of formal poets and lots of very experimental poets are open-minded. But a hell of a lot aren't. You still get the formal poets who won't accept anything that even slightly deviates from their preconceived ideas of what is good poetry. And you still get avant-gardists who look at anything conservative and dismiss it outright on the grounds that it's some backwards, or... I've seen people say that sonnets are colonialist. You shouldn't write sonnets. Don't write sonnets. They're colonialist. They're patriarchal. They support structure. Therefore, they're fascist. And it's just stupidity. But not always political. Sometimes it's just purely aesthetic that avant-gardists feel like they have to be constantly doing something that hasn't been done before. Like on every level. They make one exception to using things that have been done before, which is if they're ridiculing them. And it's anti-aesthetic. So you want to, well, I want to say to formalists and traditional formalists and say, you do realise that all these forms you like came about because of experimentation. You know? Yeah. And I want to say to experimentalists, you do realise that all those things that came about from experimentation are worth keeping because they are the ones that work. You keep the things that work. You throw out the things that don't work. And this is what we've always done.
Kind of like evolution. Exactly.
Experimentation in art didn't start in 1910, did it?
Okay. We've kind of gone off on a bit of a tangent here.
That's okay. That's what these podcasts are for.
Shall I bring it back to the next question?
What is the next question?
It's quite a long question, but persevere with me reading it out because it sets a lot of context. People will often ask me how I find time for my own work while teaching art, and do I ever wish to give up teaching to allow myself more time? But the truth is, teaching art has made a positive impact on my own artwork for various reasons. How has publishing impacted your own personal poetry, and are you a stronger/better poet because of your publishing work?
Okay, well, the thing is, it's helped me doing both poetry and publishing. The simplest answer there is well, I publish my own books. Anthony Etherin is published by Penteract Press.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have to submit manuscripts elsewhere, which, as everyone knows, is time consuming. So I save time there. I know that when I'm working hard on promoting my own poetry, I'm also promoting the press. And then when I'm busy promoting the press, I know that that's promoting my books. So the one hand is washing the other at all times here. On a more practical level then, which I think the question also is hinting at, designing books, that's made a big difference to how I write poetry. Because when I write a poem now, I'm thinking about how it looks on the page.
Yes.
At the very intricate level that I definitely would not have considered a few years ago. So the visual aspect of the poem, and I'm not talking about visual poetry, just whether a formal poem or a constraint-based poem.
The aesthetics of it on the page, how it plays with the margins and the boundaries and the spine, and the physicality of the poem on the page of a book as opposed to the digital page, which is very different.
Yeah, so I'm constantly thinking about that, about how the poem will look on the page. And this is something everyone should think about. Every poet should think about this, because you see poems. We get submissions we've had submissions for our chapbook series, where we say these are books that are 10.5 centimeters wide, and we're getting poems with 80 characters in a line. And I'm thinking, well, the only way to get that into a chapbook that size is if you've got a font size of 6 point. It doesn't work. So I think every poet should think about this. Just think about how your work is going to look on the page.
Okay, so here's another question related to the press and your writing practice. What, if any, are the tensions between writing and publishing?
Well, I saw this question, and the only thing I can really think of is an issue of time management, because there are so many times I'd rather be writing than working on the press, but I have to work on the press because of some deadline or something that's just sprung up that I have to attend to. Printing companies can be difficult. We get books back from the printers, and we're excited because we've got a new title in and we want to check it out, and we look at it and no, it's full of mistakes, and we have to get on the phone or write angry emails trying to convince the printing company to remake the defective books. And all that time I'd rather be sitting there writing a sonnet or a palindrome or something, but I can't. But that's it. I mean, that's just, like I say, that's what everybody has to put up with when you're working more than one job, which every poet does, apart from Rupi Kaur now, I imagine. So, I mean, is there anything you have to say on that?
Well, I think it's, I suppose you've got to find your own way to make a balance. It just comes down to, I suppose, reminding people that we are people too, and we're trying to do our own practice as well as running the press. And I think it can be hard sometimes when people... yet nobody likes to get rejected, but people can be quite harsh to us. You are full-time on your poetry / the press. I work a job and then support with the press. It's just the two of us doing this. So I think people just need to remember that we're people too. And we don't like rejecting poetry, but we also don't have the depth to give a lot of in-depth feedback and things like that, because we're actually trying to serve our published poets to the best of our ability, or our potentially published poets. We don't have the time and resource to give detailed feedback and things like that. We'd like to, but we don't charge reading fees, so every manuscript we read is something we're doing off our own back,
And rejecting works is hard. I don't like doing it at all. It's an awful part of the job. So it's all more worse when that person comes back and they're just being a dick.
Okay, shall we move away from this subject then? And we've got another facet of Anthony Etherin and Penteract, and this is the podcast. So, how are the podcasts going? And are you glad you started them? What have you learned?
Well, the funny thing about the podcast was that we decided to do it in November 2019. And then we dawdled, and we finally recorded the first one in January, I think, January 2020.
Mm.
And we didn't really know where it was going and how useful it would be and what the point of it was. It was just another thing to try. And then, of course, by March, we were housebound, and everyone else in the world was. And it turned out that starting a podcast was actually a very good idea, because it was the only way we were going to get to talk to people and socialize. And it was an excuse to do that. It was an excuse to just say to someone the other side of the world, hey, let's get together and talk for an hour. So that was quite an interesting coincidence that we started this without knowing what was going to happen in terms of a pandemic, which obviously we'd never had in our lives before.
Mm.
So it turned out to be quite a good move in that respect. And the first one I recorded was with Christian Book, and I completely didn't know what I was doing. But worse than that, I didn't know that I didn't know what I was doing until we clicked the record button. And suddenly I froze, and I just didn't know what to ask him. I didn't know what to talk about. I don't know why, but it just felt like I wasn't me. And it's a strange thing, that the nerves that can hit you when I'm talking to somebody I talk to all the time. You know, so that's the reason Christian was the first guest.
I was going to say, this is somebody you're comfortable having conversation with normally.
Yeah, talk to him all the time. And yet we click record, and I froze. And it's just so odd. So it's been good for me, because I've learned how to do it. I've learned on the job, and I've had to learn on the job. I can't just stop an interview halfway through and say, oh, I'm going to go and have a lie down for a bit. And these are good skills to learn. These are transferable skills. So it's definitely been good for me on a personal level. I think it's also been good, again, like as with the press, I think it's been a good thing for the poetry community. I think people appreciate it, and it's going well. We get a lot of listeners now. And it's just nice that the setup, talking to someone, even though it's very artificial, because who in real life starts a conversation? So tell me about how you got into poetry. And then you just let them talk for 15 minutes. That's not how a normal conversation works. But in a way, you really get to know that person, because they really open up and they tell you things that would never come up in a normal conversation.
It's almost like speeding up the small talk.
Yeah, well, it eliminates the small talk. I think that's the importance of it.
And I guess I know certainly from looking around, there are plenty of poetry podcasts out there, but they tend to be focused on readings of poetry and not necessarily new poetry. Just here's a poem that I like by A.N. Old Poet.
A.N. Old Poet?
Yes.
One of my favourites.
You must have heard of him. Or her. But the fact that this is a podcast talking about contemporary arts, it's not even poetry, because obviously you've drifted into other areas with the likes of music and arts, etc. So I guess it's quite interesting, because I think there's not many podcasts out there that are exploring that area.
I'm definitely more interested in learning about the person and why they've got the proclivities they have, and how they go about using them in their art, and why they bother to be a poet. That's an interesting question, I think. It's a strange thing to be when there's not a lot in it for you. Yeah, I'm interested in how people create things, and why they create things, and why they think things, and how they've come to those conclusions. And this is why, as we've been talking about lately, maybe we go beyond poetry and we look at other people who just do interesting things, people who do things that are outside the mainstream. It'll be quite nice to expand the podcast so that we're actually looking at a variety of subcultures and the way they express themselves. Mm-hmm. All this stuff this is what fascinates me.
Yeah. So I guess, by the way, if anyone can hear any soft snoring, it's because our little dog is sitting with us fast asleep. Neither of us have any weird lung conditions. It's just our dog fast asleep between us. Okay, should we move on?
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously coming to the end of the interview now, but you're about to launch your latest book, Slate Petals and Other Wordscapes, the follow-up to Stray Arts and Other Inventions. What can you tell us about this book?
Yeah, it's the sequel to Stray Arts, because it uses a lot of the same constraints, applied very differently. Again, calling back to earlier when we talked about the different approaches you can take with the same constraints. You can really see the difference between the two books that way. This book focuses a lot more on the lyrical and the simple, whereas Stray Arts wasn't afraid to be cryptic and intellectual in its subject matter. This book, the subject matter of Slate Petals, is something that I think everybody can get. It's simple. I'm not looking to explain anything. I'm not looking to make lots of references. If you think about what I said about the Edgar Allan Poe palindromic sonnet, there's nothing of that nature in it. This is more what we said with my gothic tendencies, so things like crows and the moon, but also just pastoral poems. And then when there are subject matters, it's things like fairy tales and folklore and stuff that most people will know about. There's nothing too esoteric or lofty in this book in terms of subject matter. So I'm really just focusing on the constraint, and I'm looking at the range of constraints. So Stray Arts would have looked more at the limits of constraints. And of course, there are poems in Slate Petals that do push limits, but then that's just because I want to show that's part of the range. Constraint has this range from very simple applications to very complex ones, and I want to make sure that everything's represented there. A lot of the formal poems in there are quite simplistic in their rhymes and rhythms, very simple rhymes. And the poems do go from uniformly metered triolets to then simple alphabetically constrained poems, so just a short palindrome, a short lipogram, a short anagram. And then you end up with things like the poem War Ends War, which is 2 anagrammed palindromic sonnets. There's a poem called Ragnarok, which I really like, which is a villanelle where each stanza has its own alphabetical restrictions, which of course then feed into each other because of the overarching constraint of villanelle form and iambic pentameter. And there's visual poetry in there as well. So we have the simple pattern poem, really childlike in a way, or if you prefer, traditional formal and visual poetry, and then avant-garde formal and visual poetry. So asemic poetry, extremely constrained forms. I'm just looking at the range of formalism. I want to just say I love formalism in all its forms, and that's what this book's about. It's me at my most me. Every single poem, I want it to be something that shows me at my best. I want to say, if you're into this kind of formalism, here's the best I can do at that kind of formalism. Whether that's very traditional and very simple, or whether it's very experimental and very complex. I'm just saying, this is the best I can do.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.